So we are now recording, and Aimee, kicking it off to you.
Fantastic. Okay, everybody, most of you, if you've been on a previous webinar, have seen my face before. I am the executive director of the Michelson Found Animals Foundation. I've been in this role for over 11 years now, which is insane. It is the longest I have ever had a job. And if you had asked me when I started here if I would be here for 11 years, I would have said absolutely not. In that time, we've had a whole variety of programs at Found Animals that are both operating at the level of an animal welfare organization and as a vendor to animal welfare organizations. I'll explain a little bit more about that. That has allowed us to have a very unique vantage point on the animal welfare industry and market, which is what I'm going to share with you today. So for us in Los Angeles, we operate programs like a decent sized shelter or rescue group would. We do spay neuter programs, we do adoption programs, we have a kitten nursery. Last year we did about 2,500 total adoptions, about half of which were graduates of our kitten foster program. So we actually have the experience of operating the program as an animal welfare organization. And then for our microchip program, we sell microchips and scanners and offer a free registry product to, at this point, gosh, well over 1,000 animal welfare organizations of all sizes around the country. So we also serve a wide swath of animal welfare organizations and therefore attend all of the national conferences, regional conferences, local conferences, and so really understand what shelters and rescues are dealing with and the landscape. So we've pulled that together a bit into some information here for those of you who may want to be working with animal welfare organizations to drive leads. And with that aside, can you go to the next slide, please?
Yep. Well, why is it not going? There
we go. So the universe of animal welfare organizations is bigger than just adoption groups, but what I'm going to focus on today is adoption groups because I believe that that is going to be the most relevant for most of you who are going to want to connect with pet-owning consumers. But for the sake of completeness, as we're starting here, we'll go into more detail on adoption groups. There are other groups that I lumped into what I will call direct services groups. So these might be nonprofit or even for-profit, but reasonably priced spay neuter clinics that are doing high volumes of patients, or groups who are doing surrender prevention programs in the community of some sort, or groups who are doing trap neuter return programs. So these are animal welfare organizations, some of whom may actually handle a very high volume of clients, but who are not in the adoption business, if that makes sense. And then on the far right, there are other folks who intersect with these organizations in various ways. So there's the grant makers, the ones that you probably know of off the top of your head are like PetSmart Charities, Petco Foundation, Maddie's Fund, ourselves, the ASPCA does some grant making, the Humane Society of the United States does some grant making, Best Friends does some grant making. There are some other smaller grant makers. There are the software companies, and when I say software, there are many kinds of software, but I'm primarily referring to the animal management software systems. So for any of us who handle a large number of adoptions, at some point, it's not feasible on pen and paper, and it's not even very practical in Google spreadsheets. So these are like Shelter Buddy, Pet Point, Shelter Love. There are other software on the veterinary side. Insurance companies, obviously, people want to sell pet insurance. There's all kinds of these sort of vendors to the industry that work with shelters in some way. So that's kind of all I wanted to talk about here. And then the rest of the presentation, we're going to be talking in detail about adoptions. If you're more interested in some of the other areas, at the end, we can cover some of those questions. Next slide, please, Asad. Okay. Adoption is the single largest pet acquisition channel. So the data that you're seeing here is from the 2017-18 American Pet Products Association Pet Owner Survey. They do that survey every 2 years, and they ask people where they got the pets in their home. The yellowish bar is dogs, and the bluish bar is cats. And you can see that for both dogs and cats, shelter and rescue lumped together are well over 40% and are the largest single way that Americans are getting their pets. You also see some very interesting differences between dogs and cats. So if you move one group over, cats, more than 30% of cats ended up in someone's home because they were a stray that adopted you, the human. So the choice was not yours as the human to adopt the cat decided to adopt you. Dogs don't really do that. We don't really have free roaming and stray dogs anymore, and so they don't enter our homes that way. Versus on the very far right, you see that pet store and breeder is still a significant channel, although lower than shelter and rescue for dog acquisition, but really not relevant at all for cats. Cat breeds are not, while there are cat breeds, it's not as much of a thing as it is for dogs. And then you can see there in between pet store or breeder and stray that acquiring an animal from friends or family is still about the same for dogs and cats. Now, depending on which survey, Assad, is there an issue?
So I was going to ask you your question, but go ahead, keep on.
So depending on which survey you look at, these numbers jump around a bit. So we see aggregate numbers for shelter and rescue being anywhere from the 1/3 to 40–45% range, depending on the survey, who did it, their methodology, when they did it. The reason that I always emphasize to pet product and services companies the importance of this is because there is no doubt that shelters and rescues are the most concentrated channel. So obviously you can't really get an aggregated access to the stray cats adopting people, and friends and family is highly fragmented. Even pet stores and breeders, any given pet store or breeder is probably handling a few dozen to a few hundred animals a year, whereas you have shelters who are handling a few hundred to tens of thousands of animals a year. So it really is the most concentrated, high volume acquisition channel. Did I cover what you were going to ask us at, or do you have a question?
Oh, I was just wondering, is this data for North America or USA?
US. It's US.
Okay.
Yep. It's the American Pet Products Association. There's also an every 5-year survey with slightly different data that is done by the AVMA. And there have been various other surveys out there, and all the numbers are a little different. So until they put this question on the census, which I would love to see them do, about how many, we don't know exactly how many pets are in US households or exactly where they come from. This is my particular favorite data source. Next slide would be great.
Yep. Good.
Okay, so then if we look at that channel of shelter and rescue and we break it down a little bit, there are different kinds of groups. In aggregate, there are about 5,000 physical shelters in the US, and those 5 shelters took in an estimated 5.3 million cats and dogs in 2018. That's down. Intake has been dropping steadily for several decades now. And of those 5.3 million cats and dogs that went into shelters, now we're at a point where just over 4 million leave alive and about 1.2 million die. This is much, much better than where we were even 5 years ago, let alone 10 years ago. Now, when I say shelters, those are places that actually have a physical facility and typically handle a higher volume of animals. We'll talk about rescue groups in a minute. Within those physical shelters, there are 3 models. And I'm going to highlight these for you, and then we're going to talk a little bit more about them later, because which model they are impacts how they're staffed, how they have their revenue sources come in, how they operate. The biggest chunk are government animal services. So this is a city or county municipal agency that is part of the municipal infrastructure that offers animal services. And in most cases, these organizations, we'll get to this in a minute, are handling the field services and the animal control, as well as the animal holding and adoptions. Versus the next one down is a private shelter, usually a nonprofit, that has a government contract. And there's all kinds of flavors of this. So it may be that the SPCA is contracted with the local municipality to handle stray animal or owner surrender intake, but not animal services. And animal control field services. Or they may be contracted to handle all of it. So there's a lot of different flavors within this private agency with government contract segment, which is about 30%. And then the smallest group is private shelters who don't have a contract. And those would be an SPCA or a humane society or a group who is typically a nonprofit, and they can get their animals from a variety of sources, but they are not the public safety animal agency in any way for their community. And those are often referred to as limited admission shelters, meaning they have full control over what animals they admit to their facility and when. Whereas if you are one of those government shelters that has all of the animal control and field services responsibilities, you are open intake, meaning any animal in your community that needs help, whether that's a stray, whether that's an owner surrender, whether that's a hit by car, it pretty much ends up at your doorstep no matter what. Oh, Dan from Find Pet. Do you know where we can find a complete list of shelters and rescue groups with contacts? Ha, 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 ha. Wouldn't that be nice? I am not aware that any such thing exists. There are some things that you can get access to when you have APIs into certain software, and Best Friends did just release a data tool that allows you to look at as many shelters as they can get data for all over the country. It does not necessarily have contact information, although it may link to a shelter's website. So if you wanted to manually go through all of the data points in the Best Friends tool that was just released a couple of weeks ago, I think there are the 5,000 sheltered groups are in that tool, but not in an easily exportable and downloadable way. That would be nice for all of us.
Sorry, Aimee, what was you were saying? Best Friends?
So Best Friends Animal Society. It's one of the big nonprofits. And if you go to their website, which is bestfriends.org, don't do it right now, wait until after this, you can see where they're talking about, they're calling it the community dashboard. And they've put a huge amount of effort into trying to collect data from those nearly 5,000 shelters to be able to give individual members of the public a way to look at how many animals are coming into their local shelter, how many animals are getting out alive. There's a section for each individual shelter to talk about their programs or where they need help. It is a really very cool tool, and it's brand new. It's only a couple weeks old. So then last thing on this slide is that then there are rescue groups, and we know of at least 17,000 out there. We also don't have a great contact list for them though, because the contacts come and go and the groups come and go. So this could be as diverse as a group that places less than 10 animals a year, or some of these groups end up placing hundreds, if not 1,000 or more animals a year. That's really just the top small percentage. Most of these are foster-based. They do not have a facility. Primarily, they're going to be pulling animals from these other kinds of shelters to help them achieve a higher live release rate, but some rescue groups will take in animals from the public. And as we'll talk about a little bit later, many times these rescue groups are all volunteer organizations without a single paid staff member. So onwards. This is a little bit of a visual illustration of why this can be so confusing. Just because somebody says that they're a shelter, or just because somebody says that they're a municipal agency or a government agency, that doesn't mean the same thing in terms of the programs and services that they offer. So down the left-hand side here, I've listed the big buckets. So for example, pet licensing. Okay, Vincenzo, we'll come back to that question. So pet licensing is like the license tag that hangs on the collar, and it's usually required for dogs as part of rabies control. In some jurisdictions, it's required from cats, and some it's not. Field services, in parentheses, I have AC for animal control. That's the people who, when there's a dog that's chasing kids in your neighborhood, or when there's a barking dog complaint or a dog fight or whatever it is, and you call in your public safety sort of complaints about animals, usually it's the animal control agency that has the field services, the actual officers that come out and deal with that. Then there's stray intake, owner surrender, adoptions. Then there's things like, do we offer subsidized spay and neuter or veterinary services to the public? Do we do education and outreach? Things like humane education programs or prison dog programs. All of that would be sort of in that education and outreach category. So you could have a government agency that does all of those things. In the darker solid blue are the things that most all government agencies will handle. And then in the dashed is things that they may handle, but they may not. So if they are a very well-funded government agency, perhaps with a very strong Friends of group, they may have this full spectrum of programs. Or if they're a city, for example, like some of them out there, like Austin or San Francisco, and the city folks have made the decision to adequately resource the shelter, they may do all of this, but they may also just do that solid chunk. Versus you'll see the private shelters and the rescues have different areas that are their sweet spot. But if you're a private shelter with a government contract, it's possible that you do all of those same services that the government agency would, because in that geography, the government has decided to outsource that versus having their own department to do it. Hopefully that's making sense, but it's part of why this industry gets a little bit confusing, and you can't tell from the name. So just because it says SPCA, that may make you think it's a private organization, and it very well may be structured as a nonprofit, but if they hold the contract with the local government, they may be providing all of the animal control field services. So hopefully that's a little bit helpful. I get that it's a bit opaque, and I wish that there were an easier way to decipher it. Next slide, Asad. The other thing is that volume varies widely. Obviously, in a city like Los Angeles, where we have a population of 4 million humans in the city, 10 million in the county, more people equals more pets coming through our shelters versus smaller towns. So you can see I put across the top a bit of a volume scale and then mapped, and again, there's no one size fits all. So the municipal agencies tend to be bigger than the private agencies. And you can see in the far right bottom there for the rescue groups, they tend to be the smallest. But you can absolutely have rescue groups that do over 1,000 animals a year. You can absolutely have municipal agencies that do under 1,000 animals a year. So for example, in Los Angeles, Santa Monica is one of 89 cities that are incorporated within Los Angeles County, and the city of Santa Monica is a little one, and they have their own shelter that's part of the police department, and they handle less than 1,000 animals a year. Versus, if you see on the far left there, the city of Los Angeles and Los Angeles County, which serves county unincorporated areas and 50-some contract cities, each LA city and LA County each serve about 4 million humans in their service area, and they each take in over 50,000 animals a year. So I put those in this kind of red box. There's probably less than 10 agencies in the country that fall into this category. They're sort of the mega agencies that take in more than 30,000 animals a year. And that's San Diego Humane, which runs most of animal sheltering in San Diego County, LA City, LA County, New York City Animal Care and Control. There are a couple in Texas that are in this category. Maricopa County is just under this threshold in Phoenix. So there are some that are huge, but then there are others that are still just a few hundred. In blue here, I put in that you can have some of these nonprofit veterinary service providers that also are very high volume. They're not necessarily dealing with newly adopted animals being placed in a home, and so may not be a partnership target for some of you, but as an example, there are, at least 5 different nonprofit spay-neuter providers just within Los Angeles County, all of whom serve more than 10,000 animals a year. And the largest among them, which has 3 facilities and offers subsidized spay and neuter and low-cost veterinary, serves something like 25,000 animals a year. So some of those providers can get very high volume. And so if those exist in your community and it's relevant for you, they could be worth talking to for some kinds of programs. I put a note at the bottom here. This was information that I only got a hold of once Best Friends put out their data tool, and not because they printed it anywhere, they just said it in a presentation and I wrote it down, which is that only 7% of shelters out of those 5,000 nationally have an annual intake volume of more than 5,000 animals a year. So it is very skewed, sort of 80-20, 20% of the shelters doing 80% of the volume kind of a thing. Next slide, please. And Vincenzo, I promise we're going to get to your question. Okay, so if you're thinking about why would you want to work with a shelter, and then more importantly, why would a shelter or another animal welfare group want to work with you? So Jan has a question about, is there a difference in terms of quality, efficiency, whether they're humane, for lack of a better word, between these types of shelters? Not based on organization type. You can have fantastic government shelters and you can have terrible government shelters. You can have fantastic private shelters with a government contract and you can have terrible. So in any of these categories, and I have some tips for you guys in a minute about, you got to do your homework, because there's no way to tell based on the organization's name or the organization's type or the number of animals that they take in. There's no way to tell the quality of their programming unless you really get under the hood with them. Obviously, everywhere in life, we want win-win partnerships. So it helps to think like the other side. So for your company, why would you want to work with an animal welfare group? Well, I'm assuming that for most of you, first and foremost on your mind is you want access to pet parents who can become customers because you want to sell your product. Now, something I would encourage you to think about, depending on where you are in your stage of development, is they could also be partners for testing your product and services. If you need to test something on a large volume of animals, they tend to have a captive audience, pun intended, and they also have groups of volunteers and former adopters, so they could be a testing partner. They also may be able to give you sort of credibility and endorsement if they start using your product in their facilities or in their programs, even if they're not buying it from you, or even if you're not selling it through them as an affiliate relationship. And the other thing that may not be as relevant for those of you who are at an early stage, but at a later stage, the consumer now expects companies to have a give back component. And if you're in the pet space, your customer is probably going to expect your corporate charitable giving to be to pet organizations. So these are the groups that would be the beneficiaries of that. So if you're going to do a give one, get one model, or a give a certain percentage of my profits model, this is who you're likely to be supporting. If you think about it from the animal welfare group's point of view, what is it that they want? How is it that you can help them? And more importantly, how is it that you can help them enough that they're going to engage with you in a meaningful way to help you serve your agenda? Because these are busy people, often with limited resources. So they always need help fulfilling their mission and expanding their impact. And that can look a lot of different ways to a lot of different organizations, but the next two bullet points are the most common places they need help. They need help to lower their costs, and they need help to increase their revenue. It is the case for nearly all shelters that they do not have as much budget or as much staff as they would like to do all of the life-saving programs that would help animals in their community. So they are constantly crunched, and they are constantly juggling, and they are trying to do the most they can with a limited set of resources. So if you can help them expand their resources, either by lowering their costs or increasing their revenue, that is appealing to them because it helps them fulfill their mission and expand their impact. If you're too early to do that in a meaningful way, or if that's just not how your product or service is really able to structure a relationship, there is also a value to them in exposure. All of us, ourselves included at our Adopt and Shop location, have that dog or cat that has been with us for 6 months or 2 years for no good reason, or has really special needs and needs a really specific person, or has some event or initiative that we're trying to get the word out about. And so helping us spread the word about our initiatives to a new audience or to a broader audience is another way that you can support them in fulfilling their mission. Okay, I'm gonna look at Dan's question here for a second. So what is the split for most successful channels for shelters to find foster families for their pets? Okay, Dan, I don't have data on this that is across a lot of different shelters, but what I can tell you is that it's certainly primarily digitally driven. So digital marketing, I mean, you can almost think of shelters as little retail adoption centers in a way. So depending on how sophisticated they are, it is definitely digital channels, social media. For those who have email lists, it's email. For the government agencies, and we'll cover this in a couple of slides, who tend to have less PR and marketing resources, but have probably been in the same location in their community for 30 years, people just know that that's where the shelter is and that that's where to go. And so that would be more of the walk-ins. So it varies based on organization, particularly for these rescue groups that don't actually have a physical location. They are 100% in the digital realm because they don't have a facility, and they're an all volunteer organization. So it's all on social media, website, email, etc. Any questions before we move on from this thought of win-win partnerships? Let's see. What is the average number of pets that are returned to shelters? Is most of this due to behavioral issues, or more dogs or cats returned? Okay, good question. Here's what I will say is and again, there's not national data on this. I have anecdotal data, which is that over the lifetime of the pet, we expect at least 10% of those adoptions to not stick for some reason. So we expect at least 10% of those animals to come back. And the unfortunate reality, and it's hard to predict which ones are going to come back and which aren't, is that often these animals come back to us with behavioral issues that they didn't have when they left. So they often come back to us because of a behavioral issue, but it's because of a behavioral issue that was created in the adoptive home because that animal never got trained or didn't get enough exercise or what have you. And then they are often much harder for us to place on the second go around than they were on the first go around. So they go out as puppies or kittens, and then they come back to us as rowdy teenagers or adults or even seniors that either have medical or behavioral issues. I would say that I couldn't actually tell you whether it's more dogs or cats are returned. What I can tell you where there is a differential that we see for sure is that large dogs are returned more often than small dogs. And what we believe to be the reason behind that is that it is more challenging to find rental housing that will accept your large dog. So if your housing situation changes and you have a 60, 70, 80 pound dog and you can't find any place to rent, one of the primary drivers of owner surrender at shelters, which is about, call it roughly a third of shelter intake, it varies, is people saying, I can't find housing that will take my pet, so I'm bringing my pet to the shelter or surrendering them back to the rescue group. So pets and rental housing is a whole other topic. Let's see. A lot of these folks are on Amazon and do have donation links that they share. Let's see.
Do you want me to read out some questions?
I think I'm picking up most of them. So this, are there shelters who monetize their activities? So we'll come back to that one because there are. I'm scrolling. Okay, we're coming to the funding question. And growth of the shelter software industry. Yeah, let's come back to that, Jessica. I'll speak about that a little bit. Yeah, most everybody has an Amazon wish list where if you want to donate products or encourage your followers to donate products, and then also most of them have like a link so that they get a percentage of Amazon sales. Next slide, please, Asad.
Yeah.
Okay, this is a bit of how they're funded and how they function. And I've got this red disclaimer up here at the top because there's never an answer to any of these questions that is one size fits all. So these are generalizations, but organizations vary. So please do your homework before you launch into working with somebody. Generally speaking, government shelters are funded by an allocation from the general fund, which is taxpayer money, which is the majority of their budget, followed by fees. So that's if you license your pet with them, if you adopt a pet from them, if you pay a fine or a penalty to them because you forgot to renew your license or you got a ticket for an off-leash dog, what have you. And then most shelters have a mechanism either through a city vehicle or through a Friends of group to take donations, but it tends to not be their focus. Versus if you flip over to the private shelters or the rescue groups, donations are their bread and butter. That is their primary form of revenue. For private groups that have a contract to do animal control services, those contracts tend to be a very high dollar amount. So that will be a substantial portion of their revenue if that's relevant for them. And then they will also have fees. So the rescue group will charge a fee to adopt. So will the private group. Big tip, fees for adoptions never cover the average cost of getting an animal ready to go. So I'll give you the example from us. You know, our cost on average is anywhere from $500 to $700 per animal in our care to do the spay and neuter, take care of them. For our kittens, they're with us in foster for a long time. It's all their vaccinations. It's a lot of medical, a lot of food, a lot of love, a lot of staff time. And our adoption fees for puppies max out for puppies under 6 months at $325. For adult cats, our adoption fees start at $100. And at various times of the year, we run specials and promotions or we waive adoption fees on certain animals who've been there a long time. So we never cover the cost that we've invested in an animal with the fees that we charge. Private rescue groups sometimes charge, private shelters and rescue groups sometimes charge more, but they are still not covering their costs. And on an easy animal, they may cover their costs, but for every easy animal that didn't cost them that much, then they have a handful who had outrageous medical bills. And so when you average it all out, it is not, adoption fees are not a money-making game for anybody in this business. Next line down is staffing. Government agencies are government agencies. These are people who are part of the social service, not social service, but they're part of the government service. You know, they are often unionized, and like everywhere in government, they're not swimming in resources. They don't have usually enough people to get all the work done. The private shelters are usually a private workforce. Occasionally there may be a union involved. Their resources vary widely. Some of them are very well funded and very well staffed. They do have the ability to do all the great programs they want to. Others do not. Rescue groups tend to be volunteer based. Most of them don't have any paid staff, or if they have paid staff, it's 1 or 2 people very part-time. And I put down here that when they do have a staff, whether that is a paid staff or an unpaid staff, they tend to be very evangelical, in the sense that the rescue group has coalesced around wanting to help a particular area or type of animals, and they're very passionate about that, and that's what draws them together, and that's why they're willing to volunteer their time to do it. If you want to sell to these groups, most government agencies are subject to an RFP and bidding process, unless you are under a certain very low dollar amount, like maybe $25,000 a year, or they can do a sole source justification, which is not that easy to do, but it can happen. Versus the private groups, it's all across the board. They are not by law required to have a bidding process, but many of them do as a matter of policy. And then what we have found with rescue groups, at least in our microchip business, is that this is the group that is at highest risk of non-payment. And so I would recommend prepayment options if you're going to work with them, because again, they're always hand to mouth. They're always trying to raise more money, help the next animal, or the medical case comes in that they hadn't budgeted for this month and their budget blows up. In terms of the clientele, if you are the shelter that's been there for 30 years and everybody in the community knows that you're there, you're probably going to get a broad base of customers and support that represent the broader demographics of your community, versus rescue groups, which tend to exist only in a digital realm, and which, for better or for worse, and this is an area where our organization needs work, a lot of animal rescuers look like me, solidly middle-aged, middle-class to upper-middle-class white ladies. And so we tend to have our organizations and our events focused in the parts of town where we live, and therefore it's a different demographic skew. There are some great groups out there that are trying to bring rescue and adoption and those kinds of things to a broader demographic base. But I think much like many parts of American society, we're not there yet. We have a diversity issue in animal welfare that is not yet fully addressed. And then the final line down there, marketing and PR. If you're working with these groups, you want them to be able to spread the word about you. If it's a government agency that either doesn't even have a public information officer or only has one person, what they're able to do on social media, email marketing may be very limited, versus rescue groups can often find volunteers who are very skilled who want to do that for them. Private groups may have a budget for that, they may not. So in general, government groups are not going to be as great at marketing, although there are some that are outstanding. So this is just a sort of high level structure for you guys, with the caveat that your mileage will vary. You know, any one group in any one of these categories may not fit in this framework I've provided for you. Next, please. Okay, so given all of that, let's talk about how you might design a program to work with some of these agencies. I've given 4 examples here that we can talk through. This is not comprehensive or exhaustive. This is a thought starter. The easiest thing that I have seen people do is what I call organization of the month, meaning you pick one organization, you're going to share a percentage of your revenue or profit for the month with them, and then they have an incentive and an offer code or whatever it is. You don't even need an offer code usually, just to get out in front of their audience and say, you know, Aimee's Doggy Biscuits is donating 10% of their profits this month to my shelter. So please go buy Aimee's Doggy Biscuits so that we can get a bigger donation. It's super easy. It's easy to administer. I know I'm the only group benefiting that month. So I know that if I do a great job promoting the product, I get a bigger donation. You know that as well. So it's easy to track. It's a great way to learn. It's a great way to get started. The downside to that is that it's a limited scope and scale, because you're limited to one organization a month and whatever reach I can generate, and 12 organizations a year. So that's I would say the lowest cost to implement, easiest to learn, but also hardest to grow. The next one is I've seen people successfully do what I'll call a customer designated donation, which is basically if I'm coming to your platform as a pet owner to buy your service, that at checkout, you give me the opportunity to allocate either a percentage of my purchase or to round up or whatever you want to do to a pet charity of my choice. So again, the upside of that for a shelter or a rescue group is, okay, well, if I know that your dog toy company is letting customers designate a percentage of their purchase, I'm going to tell everybody on my alumni list, I'm going to get out on my social media and I'm going to say, go buy this dog toy and then designate us at checkout and we'll get a donation. So the upside of that is that you can scale it further than the organization of the month to get, and the groups are still incentive to really put the word out, but you on your platform have to be able to administer that. So you have to have a way to populate the options for people to choose. You have to have a way to track it. You have to have a way to be able to cut the checks. And that requires a level of resources and support. The next one is donate or discount to referral is what I have named it. And again, these are my names. These are not necessarily industry standards. Where I go to some shelter, for example, if I had a cat litter product and I say, I want to donate all your cat litter for your cats in your cattery. And what I want you to do is whenever anybody adopts a cat, you tell them, oh, while your cat was in our care, they used Aimee's litter and they love Aimee's litter. It's what they're used to. They have good litter box habits with Aimee's litter. I really recommend that you buy Aimee's litter, and you put that in the litter box at home so that they have a smooth transition and that they stay happy with their litter box habits. And here's a coupon or a freebie or whatever. So you're trying to provide the product or service in the shelter at a discounted or free rate that helps the shelter with their expenses, and then train the shelter and the shelter staff about the benefits of the product so that they become your ambassador to the adopter and they really encourage the adopter to keep using that product when they take the pet home. So this is also relatively easy to implement. You know, you need a coupon code for tracking and you need to train your shelter staff. You need to figure out a price point or an amount of product that you can afford to donate. The catch with this is that you need your partner's staff to be well-trained and to be very comfortable talking about the benefits of your product to generate that good conversion rate that you want to see so that people will keep buying your product. Pay per conversion. This one, people have mixed feelings about, us included, because we have been on kind of both sides of this. So the idea with this one is that you offer a promotion at the time of adoption, such as a free first month of pet insurance or a free first vet visit. And again, you're having the partner offer this to the new pet owner. And when the new pet owner takes advantage of it, you are providing a conversion payment, an affiliate payment, however you want to, couch it, back to the partner. So one way that I see this happen is I'll use VCA as an example. So VCA is a veterinary chain. They know that a lifetime customer in a dog or a cat is very valuable to them. So they have a program where they work with shelters all over the country. And if there's a VCA clinic close to the shelter, they will give you access to a free first vet visit and a discount, like a subsidy for that new pet parent towards their bill beyond the office visit fees. And then when people convert on that offer and VCA can track it, they either give cash or they give sort of like a credit for veterinary services at their hospital that the shelter or rescue can use. Shelters and rescues love this. If they don't have access to a lot of veterinary funding, again, it goes back to that. It directly lowers my costs. It allows me to help more animals. I would say the challenge here for both parties is the conversion tracking. And so you have to have a system for that, which requires some investment and setup. But the good news about that is then you're only paying for people that you know converted to being a customer. So I'm going to read some questions here. Oh my goodness. And you guys can type in any if you have questions about these program ideas. Okay, so I'm going back to, do you find animal shelters in the U.S. more open than here to partnerships with startup with innovative service that might help them in some ways? So I would say our experience is that all shelters are open to this, with the caveat that it has to be a win-win partnership. And so you need to think through, what are you going to offer them and what do you need them to do, and how can that be in balance and also benefit you? I see a lot of companies go to shelters with suggestions that are going to benefit the company, but not really the shelter or rescue, or not benefit the shelter or rescue very much for the amount of work they're going to have to do. And that's when, you know, things don't tend to work so well. Okay, let's come back to shelter software, because I got to see another question on shelter software. Okay, so the question about you can get a gun easier than a cute dog. Yeah, that is an issue in the US as well. As the number of animals coming into shelters has decreased and the demand for adoption has increased, particularly those rescue groups, they can have lengthy application processes and home checks. What is considered best practice in the animal welfare industry is something called open adoptions, where you do not interrogate people. And you do not put them through the ringer. You do have a conversation because you want to make sure that the animal is going to an appropriate home, and you want to support that home if they need resources or education. I guess the challenge comes in when you've got puppies now. There aren't puppies in rescue that often, or dogs of a certain breed. If you're a rescue group or a shelter and you have 20 people that show up that want that one animal, how are you going to decide who gets the animal? So there are situations where they do layer things on as a way to differentiate between a lot of applicants. Some even get into a bidding situation. So our local public shelter, the government shelter, has a bidding process where it's like, if this animal is available for adoption at 8 a.m. and 20 people show up and want the animal, they do a blind bid. You literally write down on a piece of paper the amount that you're willing to pay. And this ends up being way above what the standard adoption fee would be. You put your name on it, you put it in a hat, they go in the back room, they pick it out of the hat, they figure out who's willing to pay the most. And so if somebody is willing to offer $1,500 for that animal and somebody else was $1,250, the person willing to offer $1,500 gets to adopt the dog or cat, and that money becomes a donation to programs and services for the shelter. So yeah, it can get crazy, but open adoption, where we don't interrogate people and ask for 3 years of financials and for your first grade teacher to vouch for your character, like, that is the trend we're trying to support. Yep, so Sandra talks about rescue demographics and our middle-aged white women problem. Okay. How long is the decision-making process for what, Assad?
Oh, sorry, I was asking about all these program ideas. Like, if I'm a startup or a company that just is approaching you, do I need 3 months lead time before a decision is made on, or can it be a couple weeks? Should it be 6 months?
Great question. Rescue groups, because they're smaller, they tend to be able to be more nimble. Government shelters are subject sometimes to government process. So if it's something that it's easy for them to say yes to without requiring any of the administrative approvals of their city council or their city manager, it could be quick, but government agencies do sometimes have a longer process, and so it could be 3 to 6 months. So that's another one where there is not any single answer, but smaller groups can usually move faster, and private agencies can usually move faster than government entities. Let's see. Split for an average funding structure, private, online donation, offline donation. Oh gosh, it's all over the place, Dan. It really depends on the group and where they're located and what their programs are. Okay, so can we go to the next slide? Okay, so here are some more partnership questions to consider, and that is, there are all kinds of shelters and rescue groups out there, and they have different philosophies. And so if you care a lot about the philosophy and the values of the organizations that you're working with, for example, you don't want to work with a group that has a 30-page adoption application, go research that before you reach out to them. Go to their website, go to their Facebook page. You know, if it's important to you that a group that you work with embraces diversity, go to some of their events, see who their staff is, see who they're serving. On their Facebook page, you can see the tone of the comments and the discussion. If you see things that make you uncomfortable, they're probably not the best partner. To the question previously about, do some of these organizations already monetize what they're doing, and does that make them a good partner? Corporations that are far bigger than most of you have figured this out to a certain extent. So for example, like Hill's Science Diet does a big shelter food program where they provide food to shelters for free. And the shelters that are on the program send home new adopters with a free trial-size bag of Hill's food, and then also share the contact information so that Hills can follow up for marketing. Same thing, for example, with the VCA program that I was talking about. So if the shelter that you're looking at already has a food partnership or already has a veterinary partnership that they are monetizing to fulfill their mission, and you're in that same category, they may not be the best target partner. If you think they are going to be a good target partner, you want to think about their volume. So if you're going to donate product for free, can you support that volume? If you expect only 1% of their adopters to convert or 10% of adopters to convert, is that going to be a meaningful lead generation channel for you? You also want to know a little bit about their budget, because you want to be thinking about, okay, well, if this is an organization with a $20 million budget, and what I have to offer them is going to be $500, while they love that $500, they're probably not going to be willing to change their system and process or train their whole staff or make a huge amount of effort for something that is very out of proportion to their financial situation. So you want to be thinking about, whether it's cash or something else, how can you offer a meaningful benefit, particularly if you are going to ask them to put in a meaningful amount of work. And then if it's a PR partnership, what can they do? What's going to be a good fit? If it's the kind of thing where you're going to need their staff to represent your product or service, how are you going to train them? How are you going to incentivize that? And then if you want to sell to them, I would say that the large government shelters, whether or not they have an RFP process, it tends to be very slow. You may have to put in bids. It may happen months in advance. The good news is once you get the contract, it may be a 3 to 5 year contract. So that's great. And then there was a question way back about the Animal Foundation and different microchip brands. And I don't remember the exact question, but yeah, we offer chips, but we are a vendor to shelters. And so we bid in RFPs, and we think we have the best product out there, and we offer affordable chips and scanners on a free registry. But sometimes we get underbid by a competitor. And so sometimes there will be a shelter who has been with us for years, and somebody will come in and offer them a crazy low price that we can't compete with, and we lose the business. And then in other cases, we'll have a shelter who went with somebody who was the lowest price in their last round of bidding, and realized that, yeah, it was a lower price on the front end, but then they kept trying to gouge my customers on the microchip registration, which we offer for free. And so then they come back around to us and say, ooh, we made a mistake. We're writing our RFP differently this time around because we realized that the registration may not be a front end cost, but it matters to our customers. So different groups go back and forth with which chips and registries and scanners that they use. And there's turnover in which insurance provider they use, or which pet food provider, et cetera. So even though I said, listen, if they already have a veterinary partner, you want to know that. That doesn't mean they're totally off limits. You just probably want to ask them, they're happy with that program, what's working and what's not. So you understand how you can offer something that's a differentiated value that they're going to want to use. This is a great suggestion. You can also go to events. They will also, if they're doing adoption events, sometimes they'll be happy to let you table, sometimes for free, give out samples, which is a great way to engage with them in the local community. Oftentimes you can donate a small amount of product or a gift basket to their annual auction or to their gala event. So those are good ways to start building relationships and to start getting to know people. Any one of those things may not drive the number of customers that you want, but it's a great way to learn. And if you start stacking those things up, they can become meaningful. Asad, I think we're pretty much at the end here. Can you flip forward? Okay, so these are all of the upcoming webinars that you can find for LEAP. But Ronnie, can you please put in the panel picker link? I have a request for all of you. We think there should be more pet content at South by Southwest. So RGA, Kinship, and Found Animals have submitted a panel, and Ronnie just put the panel picker link. So we would love your help by going to that link, and you have to either sign in or create an account and vote for our panel. And the way it looks is that you do this vote up over there on the left once you are signed in. And so if you are so inclined, we would love your support to get our program, to get Leap Ventures on the stage at South by Southwest in 2020. This is also, if you're on the Leap mailing list, this also came out in our email today. If you're not on the Leap mailing list, I would highly encourage you to get on the Leap mailing list. Thank you, Karen, for having already voted. Yeah, bravo. Okay, so who has additional questions? Feel free to put them in the chat. Oh, shelter software. Yes, Jessica. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about shelter software. So shelter software is a very crowded and competitive space because folks have realized that the shelter software is where both the fees are transacted for adoptions. So there's the money stream that if you either take a percentage of it or charge a processing fee, that can be a revenue source. They've also realized that if you can own or control that interface, that payment interface for the adopter, that is an opportunity to offer the adopter additional products and services, which is a way to monetize, or to encourage the adopter to donate to the rescue group, sign up for a monthly plan or something like that. There are not that many shelter software providers out there. Shelter Love is one of the new entrants, and then there's one called, oh my gosh, I should know this. I'll think of it, but it's not a very crowded space. And again, because it's 5,000 clients nationally, only 7% of which do more than 5,000 adoptions a year, 60% of which are government facilities, which have an RFP process and usually pick on the lowest bidder and are constantly underfunded. So selling software into the shelter market is not easy, and most people think it's not lucrative. So I don't know that I would say that it's a growing market. I would also say that in my kind of 11 years in the business, even though I've seen many, many iterations of people wanting to find a good way to monetize that point of sale, that the only things that I've seen work in any meaningful way are getting more donations at the point of sale. Pet parents are savvy consumers and they want to comparison shop. And so they are not all running at the opportunity to add additional products and services to their cart at that adoption checkout. I don't know, Jessica, if that actually answered your question somewhat. Hopefully it did. Great.
Aimee, can I ask a question?
Of course.
How do you think about internationally rescue organizations or shelters or things like that?
That is a great question. Honestly, we don't think about it as much because it's just not as robust and well developed internationally for a variety of reasons. And then any of the international folks who are on this call, please comment because you're going to have more knowledge about your local market than I do. So I'll just speak in some high level generalities, which is to say that, for example, in many places in Europe, like Northern and sort of Western Europe, the ethos around pet keeping is a little bit different. And so less people have pets. There aren't as many maybe stray pets. There aren't as many people giving up pets because less people had pets in the first place. And so there's not as much of a mismatch, so to speak, between supply and demand as what we have historically had in the US. So there wasn't a need for 17,000 rescue groups trying to help pets. So it's a very different market, much like in the UK, for example, pet insurance penetration is much higher than in the US. And so there's a very different conversation about managing veterinary costs for pet owners in the UK versus in the US. Certainly there are places in Europe, and this is more sort of Southern and Eastern Europe, where there are still, street dogs and outdoor cats, et cetera. And I think in those places, there just isn't as much infrastructure and resources around rescue. And then when you go sort of rest of the world, it gets like Australia, incredibly well developed, companion animal sort of setup. And Africa, very, very different. So I think that the US is a unique market, both in the level of pet ownership and the amount that people spend on their pets. And then that has created this specific animal welfare marketplace. So it does exist internationally, but I don't think that it is as concentrated or as robust anywhere else in the world. But that may change in the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. I think we are coming up upon the end of our time. Aimee, thank you so much. If you guys have any more questions, oh, sorry. You want to answer?
Dan, so I would say the mismatch between supply and demand in Europe is smaller than in the US. And then I will also say that the data that I showed earlier was about 1.2 million that died, but you've got to keep that in the context of, we believe that there are 150 million dogs and cats in US households. So while 1.5 million animals dying in shelters sounds like a huge number, when you compare 1.5 million pets dying each year to the 150 million in US households, it's a really tiny percentage. And of course, we all want it to be lower and ideally zero. It will never be zero. And it's much better than back in the 70s when we were killing 20 to 30 million pets in shelters each year. So the numbers on stray pets are really hard to get. There's not a lot of free roaming and stray dogs in the US anymore. We do still have a lot of free roaming and stray cats. Cats are a really unique situation because it's the only species on the planet, of which I am aware, where both the feral cat, who wants nothing to do with humans and doesn't need us, and the domestic cat, who wants to curl up in your lap, are genetically identical. So it's really hard, and within one generation, it can go from a domestic cat to a feral cat. So essentially all of the feral and stray cats out there are offspring of what were once a pet cat. So there's this very fungible marketplace between cats in homes and stray cats, and we don't have a good way to track it or understand the data. So there's widely varying estimates out there about how many stray cats there are. Yeah.
I'm going to end it there. And then any other questions that you want us to answer, let's move to the Slack channel and we can go from there. Thank you all for joining us and looking forward to seeing you at one of our future webinars. Thank you, everybody.
Bye, guys.